Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my fantabulous co-host, Meghan Day, Principal Solution Designer at Diligent. Meghan, how are you today?
Hey, Dottie. Just going through my photos from the weekend, doing a little editing. Found a cute one of my near 2-year-old daughter in her little Penn State football outfit for the first home game. And I didn't love the background. I'm sorry, I'm going on a story time. I popped it into my little AI photo editing app and said, hey, give me a festive Penn State football background. And oh my Lord, you should see the output. All I have to say is creative class. Don't worry that AI will be coming for your job anytime soon.
Was it about as bad as the old Will Smith video eating pasta? Or
Yes. I mean, it's kind of amazing for its ingenuity, perhaps, is the best way to describe it. But I mean, aside from the usual, she has 5 extra fingers and 5 extra toes. It's a marvel. I'll send it around so we can post it on the podcast page.
That sounds really funny. I mean, I now I have in my head visions of her being attacked by a Nittany lion.
I mean, she's playing football as a 2-year-old on the field at Beaver Stadium, but it's like a Beaver Stadium unlike any football field you've ever seen before.
Well, Meghan, I've just been on great AI/governance overload for the last couple of weeks because right on the heels of our Elevate Leadership Summit and Elevate Conference, where we talked about AI a lot, I then went to Corporate Board Members Boardroom Summit up in New York, and they did a session on how AI is going to change corporate governance. Also, including Florin Rotar, who I mentioned is the Chief AI Officer for Avanade. And, he has such a great line that he said it both at our conference and at this one, I just think is so profoundly true. And that is, we have probably grossly overestimated what AI is going to be able to accomplish in the short term and grossly underestimated how AI is going to change things over the long term. And I think that's just so true. I mean, to your point, here you are just trying to get a cute background behind the picture of your daughter, and she ends up with extra fingers and toes, and suddenly she's playing football. But, I don't know if you caught the news coming out of San Francisco and Dreamforce, where the comedian John Mulaney kind of eviscerated the audience over the AI hype. And, said things like, if AI is truly smarter than us and tells us humans should die, then maybe we should all die because you're all imminently replaceable.
Harsh, man.
I mean, beyond being harsh and funny, was really kind of interesting, right? It's an interesting commentary on sort of where we are in this moment. And I think back, I'm old enough, Meghan, that I can think back to my first job where we didn't yet have a web page. And me and my very bad HTML skills and a notepad app created their first web page. And at the time, I remember everyone asking me, like, why do you think we need this? And me saying, I think in very short order, we're going to be one of the only organizations that doesn't have one. And I couldn't at the time have even imagined how much my life was going to change over the next 15 years because of the internet. I'm sure that is true for generative AI. I'm sure I can't even yet imagine how my life is going to be different 5 years from now, let alone 10 years from now with generative AI. The rapid pace of expansion of this technology is breathtaking. Bad photo editing aside.
Well, it makes me laugh because John Mulaney also said he thanked the crowd for fundamentally changing the world for his 3-year-old son, ensuring that his son will never talk to an actual human again.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I always think of that same meme that I saw a couple weeks back that has not left my head, and that is, I don't want generative AI to create art and music to free me to do my own laundry. It's like I just think about that all the time. I mean, I think there's just so much left to be explored. But listen, we're not here to talk AI today. We're going to talk about some other things.
You're not gonna believe it, Dottie, but I actually have a segue, it's a rough segue from AI to our topic of conversation today, and that is the story I was reading about John Mulaney at the very bottom. It's, does a great job and serves me up the next article, and it is AI data centers more than 600% worse for the environment than tech companies claimed.
Oh boy. Well, that is a good segue, Megan, because we had the opportunity to speak with maybe one of my favorite directors ever, Lisa Bougie. She's the independent director on a number of boards, including Eileen Fisher, Cora, Maker Sites, Pendleton Woolen Mills, and she has been deep into climate and sustainability and ESG for a number of years. And I think uh, I really think does maybe one of the best jobs ever of just very clearly, cogently explaining why this matters to your business and how you need to think about things differently and why it is important for your bottom line. And so I was just delighted to have a chance to speak with her on the podcast and share this interview with our audience. I hope that they'll enjoy it.
Love it. Let's give it a listen.
Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Lisa Bougie, an experienced independent director currently serving on the boards of Eileen Fisher, Cora, Maker Sites, and Pendleton Woolen Mills. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, listen, I got to know you because you have been a speaker in our climate and sustainability strategy program. And I know you've had this long career that has always touched on areas related to corporate sustainability strategy. So I wondered if you could share a little bit more about your career background and how you became interested in that area.
I'm happy to. And actually, I'll answer in reverse. Values have factored into my professional choices from the beginning. I suppose I have my parents and certainly my education to thank for that clarity. So, with that in mind, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest with a deep appreciation for nature. And my dad instilled in us from the time I can, remember a mentality of leave it better than you found it. And really, if we think about that mindset, we're talking about steward leadership. So, in so many ways, the work that I do today relative to supporting and building responsible business is simply an extension of that.
I think that's really powerful. Yeah, I'd love to find out a bit more there about, really focusing in on your career as an independent director. I mean, you've served on so many different boards, and you certainly served on the boards of companies that I think of as having really sophisticated sustainability strategies. I'm thinking specifically of Eileen Fisher as a good example, that sort of circular economy approach. So, what are some of the things that you see as the greatest benefit of integrating sustainability goals into the overall business strategy?
I have to reveal up front that in my book, the only way is the integrated way. So the reason for that is actually pretty simple, and that is because it's been my experience that the very best results are achieved when every single person in an organization understands the why. And what I mean by that is, what is the motivation for setting the goal or the goals in the first place, both in terms of how they tie into a company's overarching purpose and also relative to both the inherent risks that a company is looking to mitigate and the opportunities, of course, that come with that. Um, I'm reminded of a parable, the Three Masons. Have you heard that parable?
No, no, please share it.
Yeah, sure, I will. I'll tell my kind of quick version of it. So a traveler finds himself walking by a construction site a few days in a row and gets curious about what they're up to. And so he gets the attention of three masons, and he asks, what are you guys doing here? And the first mason, a bit kind of disgruntled with sweat on his brow, says, "Oh, we're moving bricks, and it's painstaking work." The second mason says, with a bit of a smile on his face, "We're building a wall." And the third mason, with beaming with pride, says, "We are building the most glorious cathedral you have ever seen in your life." The difference between a tactical orientation, a goal orientation, and a visionary kind of purpose-led orientation is so different relative to a human's ability to connect with a goal. What I see most often get in the way of a well integrated sustainability strategy in business is short termism. That is a leader's prioritization of short term business imperatives in the and kind of with the belief that those things have to be mutually exclusive, which of course they don't. Um, but it's super interesting actually, because as climate related risks accelerate, a company's ability to achieve short term goals will be inhibited if they haven't built in the resilience. So we're reaching a point, and certainly I think we're experiencing it with extreme weather events, that in fact the two are necessary kind of synergistic approaches to optimizing business results.
I think we certainly saw lots of examples of that during the pandemic, right? Especially when it comes to things like supply chains, where, if we had too short term of a mentality, we're focused too much on finding the best price on something, maybe had too many suppliers all in one location, and then the pandemic hit, and lo and behold, those factories were shut down. And I think that was a kind of an extreme example of that. I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about some of the common myths or misconceptions about sustainability that you encounter or have to debunk in your work as a board member? I mean, there's so many headwinds right now on sustainability just overall. What do you see that needs to be debunked?
Of course, there are many myths, there are many misconceptions. I'll highlight two. We can see where it goes. The first is perhaps more of a misconception, and that is that sustainability strategy equals compliance. Okay, newsflash. Compliance by itself is not a strategy, right? And so there's nothing strategic about compliance alone. And of course, the magic happens relative to the optimization of value creation when boards are adequately recognizing the risks that climate change present and translating those risks into opportunities. So that's one, just at a high level. Another is a belief, I would classify this more under myth, that sustainability strategies will force compromised financial results. Not true. In fact, it's been quite the opposite in my experience, both as an operator and also as a board director. When organizations take the time to educate themselves and understand what the most material risks that they're facing are, whatever type of risk, transition risk, physical risk, we can go through all of them, both create goals to mitigate those risks, but then so importantly, create goals that turn those risks into opportunity. Top line growth happens or is revealed. Efficiencies are revealed. So top line growth, profitability through efficiencies, deepened brand loyalty by stakeholders. Of course, consumers care more than ever. And I think it's important to say also the ability to attract and retain talent is enhanced. So all of these ways in which value can and is derived through climate action and integrated strategies are very real.
Do you have maybe an example you could share of that? Because I think that's such a powerful idea, right? That you're right. There's a lot of fear that if we spend too much time talking about sustainability strategy, we're going to be losing out on sales or we're going to be, hurting the bottom line. And I think you're right in that when it's done well, when it's done right, it's really kind of the opposite effect. So I'd love to ask you if you just have a good example of that.
Sure. I'll use my experience, one of my many experiences with Eileen Fisher. You've already brought up the company as one which certainly is leading relative to sustainable practices and has so for decades, actually. One of the things that comes to mind there is the incredible work that has been done with regard to ensuring that the materials, no pun intended relative to materiality, because it actually is the largest impact. The materials used in the company are not just organic, but that we're sourcing them in a way that is regenerative. Now, let me get more specific for those listeners that aren't apparel oriented, hopefully not too geeky, but cotton is a fiber that uses the most water of any natural fiber and also is most at risk relative to climate change, right? And so the company's ability to work with regenerative farmers and also to counter source to other materials that are more resilient has put them in a position to not just be able to maintain production, but actually to be able to maintain, in some case, decrease costs of the fibers within materials because of the proactive nature with which raw materials have been sourced.
That's a great, great example. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the board and the management team and the shareholders and the other stakeholders around sustainability goals and strategy. I would imagine that this has to be a team sport, right? This can't be something that's cooked up by one person, like the sustainability officer, and just presented. It has to be a team sport. So how do you align all these different interests, some of which might be competing with one another? How do you do that well?
I think in my experience, no differently than the rest of the strategic plan, right? And I actually think I see teams get tripped up here. I want to recognize that relative to kind of the barriers and challenges that prevent boards from driving climate action, amongst them, at the top of the list is a lack of board education on climate, right? So I think I will, get to the heart of your question, but the first thing is make sure that those that are guiding and or creating the strategy, so that could be a combination of course, board members and operators, but first create a shared language, right, and understanding of the facts. I'm not asking for people to be, fluent, but to be conversant, right? So that's really important. Next is understand where the largest problems reside. This too is largely an education based approach, but oftentimes I have encountered very well-intended leaders making their teams jump through hoops that frankly won't amount to much at all in the grand scheme of things, right? So understanding where the significance of the focus should be. I'm a big fan of the TCFD framework, which is a framework that I love for its simplicity because it allows teams to get their heads around the different types of risks related to climate change, and then to translate those risks into opportunities, which I've referred to a couple of times now already. But regardless of the framework that teams are using, after the materiality is understood, it's really it's a process of prioritization, of course, ensuring that there's clear accountability, aligned rewards, and a great plan for stakeholder engagement and communication. So if we think about those underpinnings, honestly, it's not any different than any other strategy within a company. But I think we can recognize that oftentimes that first hurdle is the discomfort with the not knowing.
I think that's really, really good advice. I want to go back to something you said earlier about, compliance is not a strategy. Totally, totally agree. And yet often I think for a lot of companies, compliance is an entry point. It's a kind of a way into this area. If it's not something they've really done before, it's not something they're ready for, maybe there's now a new regulation or there's a new requirement or a new request and they feel they need to comply with it, and that's kind of how they get into it. How do you go from there to really a full culture of sustainability within the company? And how do you really kind of take that approach of, we need to figure out what we're doing, we need to set the strategy, and how does that become the culture of the organization?
It goes back to the Mason story in my opinion, which is ensuring that the efforts are tied back to purpose. And I realize that in the continuum of companies that, maybe haven't defined a purpose, or those that are intimately, close to theirs, that there is a wide continuum there. But, I'll share Nike's evolution. I spent a decade of my career at Nike, and the mission of the company has been the same as long as I know, which was, around 2003, so over 20 years, which is to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world, right? So that has stood the test of time for the company. But a few years back, when Mark Parker was still the CEO of Nike, he pulled a part of the executive team together and said, listen, like, we actually can't fulfill our mission of bringing inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world if our planet is a disaster. And so ultimately, the company added an addendum, if you will, or a subheader of a mission to help protect the future of sport for athletes. With a recognition, help protect the future of sport for all athletes. That pivotal to that verb of protect was the company's responsibility to move to net zero. And with that came, speaking of risk to opportunity, with that came the creation of a whole new line of products, which did very, very well. And I know that effort has continued. But I think that's a great example of kind of evolution and in fact, how we can get team members to connect to the why.
I love that. That is such a great example. I also want to go back to something else you said, which I fully agree with, which is that, board members, senior leaders need to be conversant in these topics. They need to sort of build up that muscle. So what are some of the skills or competencies, especially that corporate directors should have, so that they can be conversant in these issues and do an effective job of overseeing and guiding sustainability efforts for their companies?
One of the first things that I learned as a board director from a peer at Eileen Fisher is, basically, if you don't have the depth of knowledge, call in the experts, right? And so I think, as a starting point, it's uncomfortable for directors to be unknowing, but you have to acknowledge where you're at. For myself, when I made a decision a number of years ago that this was an area that I wanted to flex into and build my skills, I took a course. And at the time, it was one of the only ones that existed. It happened to be through Cal Berkeley. And of course, now there are many. And I know that you have one as well, which I'm thrilled about. But in any event, if an individual isn't willing to put in the energy for, kind of deep subject expertise, I do think that there are some really basic things that all board directors should have an awareness to. I'm going to point to some resources that I've found helpful. I have found the CGI, the Climate Governance Initiative website, to be extraordinarily helpful as a resource. I also use quite a lot the World Economic Forum's website as kind of high-level guidance. But to your point about kind of skills and maybe even mindsets, I'll rephrase your question. I answered your question at the very beginning of this conversation relative to kind of my orientation toward steward leadership. I do think there is an essentialness in this moment of leaders to ensure that they have a big picture orientation. And much like my dad taught in me to leave it better than you found it, with companies to orient to the longer term to ensure that whatever those short-term goals are, you're not burning the bridge behind you, right? So steward leadership mindset, I think, is really important. Also, creative problem solving. In the boardroom can be, sometimes heads down, kind of moving through stuff. But I think we have to make time for, more expansive thinking, even in that setting, and give space and time to operating teams, but also to board directors to be creative about the way in which they're solving their problems. I'll tell you a quick story. A friend of mine is on the board of a family-owned mining company. Obviously, that industry has some work to do when we're talking about sustainability. She joined the board with a belief that there was opportunity to kind of offset some of their operations from a carbon standpoint. And together helped a very kind of old school family-owned mining company realize that the land that they had, the buffer land that they had around their mining facilities that was essentially just sitting there unused, could be used for windmills. And at first they thought she was a little, out there, but now on all of that buffer land, they have windmills going. This board could have not found that opportunity had it not been for the catalytic nature of, the person that I happen to know on that board. But I think that's just a great example of creative problem solving. The last thing that I'll say in terms of, I'll call it a competency more than a skill, is bold decision making. This is not a rubber stamping, moment, people. Like, critical thinking and bold decision making are vital to good governance and obviously to be able to fulfill the penultimate responsibility, which is value creation. So those are a few.
I think those are some really helpful examples and really kind of a good list of things for boards to kind of keep their eyes on. You're a great person to ask this question. What are some of the emerging trends or opportunities in sustainability that you're most excited about? And what are some of the big risks that people should be aware of?
I'm going to clarify that question. Are you interested in actual innovations or more sustainability trends?
Good question. I think I'd rather hear from you which one excites you the most, because again, this is something you eat, sleep, and breathe. So tell us the good news.
I think my answers may be shocking, but to be honest, the thing that I'm excited about in the US in support of climate action is regulation. and, and I wish the listeners could see your face right now. It sounds a little crazy, but here's the deal. We need both private and public sectors working together to drive the scale of change that is required here. And we're behind in the US. The regions of the world, in particular the EU, that are ahead of us in from a regulatory standpoint, are making much better progress. And so I realized that probably was not what you expected me to say, but it's the truth. And of course, like, we can't wait around for that because the SEC's hung up and California might be pushing out. So clearly we need to light a fire and make sure that the education is in place to create motivation before that. But I actually think regulation will help.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think you might be the first person that we've interviewed who is most excited about regulation.
I
So,
know.
definitely a new one. But thank you for sharing that.
Oh, I just wanted to say that, of course, there is a shadow side to that. And that is, I suppose, something that we've already talked about, which is the trap of a compliance mindset. People getting pulled into kind of like the drudgery of disclosure, right? So that's the watch out. But again, I do feel like it can pull organizations into action in a way that will be meaningful.
Well, Lisa, I feel like I could talk to you for 3 hours and never get enough, but we're coming up on the end of our time. And so there are 3 questions that we like to ask every guest that joins us on the show. And so the first question is, what's the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
Mm. Well, the role will be harder. The role will be more complex. The role will be more fluid, and the role has never and will never have been more important. I think that the responsibility that we have as directors today and certainly 10 years from now is going to be absolutely pivotal to the future of a lot of things. I won't get too dramatic. But we're feeling that now, but in 10 years from now, with the way in which the world is accelerating, I think it'll feel real different.
I agree with you. And what is the last thing that you read or watched or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
So I have to admit that, okay, so actually, let me back up. I'm going to answer your question. I read over the summer Rick Rubin's The Creative Act. Rick Rubin is a legendary music producer. He is wildly unconventional and kind of equally prolific. And I started to think about, what if we ran board meetings with the philosophy that Rick Rubin talks about in the Creative Act? What would that look like? And here's what it would look like: create an open and receptive atmosphere, embrace creativity and innovation, cultivate authenticity and vulnerability, embrace flexibility and uncertainty, and create a meaningful experience. Not bad.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. I love that. That's fantastic. And finally, Lisa, what is your current passion project?
I love to garden. Back to, I suppose, my roots of nature. So here we are in September. I live in Santa Barbara. We are kind of at the end of some of the gardening season, but the thing that I love to grow the most is dahlias. And mine have bloomed heroically all summer. And I particularly love to cut them and take bouquets to friends, kind of, that are unsuspecting. It brings me a lot of joy, and hopefully them too.
Well, we're all going to have to find a way to be your neighbor.
Yes. Well, actually, I sometimes take little pictures and then send virtual bouquets to friends from afar. So, Dottie, you may be a recipient soon.
Oh, please do. I would love to get that. Thank you so much. Well, Lisa, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We've been joined today by Lisa Bougie, an experienced independent director currently serving on the boards of Eileen Fisher, Cora, Maker Sites, and Pendleton Woolen Mills. Lisa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Well, great interview, Dottie. I am so in lockstep with her about compliance not being a sustainability strategy. I certainly get your point that it's an entryway for a lot of organizations, but such good stuff from her.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a good point, right? Compliance is the starting point, not the ending point. And compliance isn't a strategy. It's just compliance.
It's just compliance.
Yeah, it's just the bare minimum you have to do in order to be within regulatory compliance. But I have to just say something different though, Meghan. She definitely gets the big tip of the cap for maybe one of the best governance reads I've heard this year. Rick Rubin's The Creative Act. I mean, that was just utter brilliance, the way she broke that down. It was so good.
Let's talk about how boardrooms will be different 10 years from now. Hopefully, we'll have more board members citing creative geniuses like Rick Rubin regularly in the boardroom.
Seriously. I mean, just so terrific. Well, but listen, Meghan, you saying that reminds me of something I wanted to ask our audience. And audience, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a question. But we are at the beginning stages of planning what we're going to be doing with this show next year. And, it's been really kind of fascinating. Meghan and I were reflecting. This is our 5th year of doing this podcast. If you can believe it. Meghan, I kind of can't believe it. But we've been doing this now for 5 years. And, it's time for us to really get some insight from our audience. What do you want? We offer this as both an audio podcast, and then we have Inside Today's Boardrooms, which is a short video podcast, which we then also put the audio of on this same channel. We are still, working hard to find board directors and governance thought leaders and researchers that we can talk to about a wide variety of topics. But we want to hear from you. Tell us by sending us an email at podcast@diligent.com what you think of the show. And I mean, be specific. Do you like the length? Do you want more rant, less interview, more interview, less rant? Who do you want to hear from? What topics do you want us to cover? Do you want video? We need to hear about all of it. So give us your feedback. We're very eager to hear from you. And if you could try to send us an email in, let's say, like the next month or so, we will absolutely consider what you tell us in the planning for next year. And Meghan, anything to add? What do you want to hear from our audience?
I don't know. I'm just still thinking about that interview with Lisa. That was one of those interviews where Dottie, I took down some notes during the interview. It was great.
So good. So good. So please, audience, send us an email at podcast@diligent.com and tell us what we need to hear. We would love to hear from you. And Meghan, that wraps up another episode of said Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. I'm Dottie Schindlinger, and you've been also listening to Meghan Day. I'd like to say a few special thank yous to, first and foremost, our climate and governance expert, Lisa Bougie, podcast producer, Kira Ciccarelli, the team at Oxenfree for making this podcast a reality, and most especially Diligent Corporation for sponsoring this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. You can also listen to our episodes and check out Inside Today's Boardrooms, presented by Diligent Institute, a weekly web show covering best practices for today's corporate boards and committees by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.